What you're seeing right here is Semitic or at least non-Egyptian slaves making straw bricks. It's right there.
Shalom, everybody. Peace and blessings. Now, before we get started, I first want to read this verse into Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. It says, all scripture is given by inspiration of Yahuwah and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. Now, some people like to only read and focus on the New Testament, which is made up of the Gospels and the letters of the apostles. Some people like to read the book of the prophets and deal with end times prophecy. Some people like the poetry aspect of the Bible, and some people like to focus on the book of the laws. Now, none of them is wrong for you to do. All of these things matter. It says all scripture is given by inspiration of Yahuwah. All of this is necessary for us to grow and to learn and to become knowledgeable and wise in the word of the Most High. So none of these we should discount. It doesn't say only the New Testament is given to us by Yahuwah. It doesn't say only the Old Testament is given by Yahuwah. It says all scripture. So if you want to focus on one thing more than the other, because that's something that you're really into and knowledgeable in, there's nothing wrong with that. But you shouldn't discount anything else as well. So for me, I am more into history. I like to learn a lot about history. And what I do is I tie it back into the Bible. And it is done in truth. I like to be truthful about everything that I teach here on this channel. So everything is well researched. It is not just my opinions. If it is my opinion on a certain subject or matter, I will let that be known. But most things are well researched and documented. Today's videos, it's going to be focused on the history as it pertains to the Bible. And in that history, Africa is very, very relevant, despite most people casting it out as irrelevant in today's world. But in the words of Kyrie Irving, Africa is in it. Whether you like it or not, whether you want to acknowledge it or not, Africa is in it. And that is the simple truth. And I'm going to provide evidence and proof of that being the truth. So let's begin. Okay, so being truthful in all things, we must first admit that Africa does not appear in the Bible in that exact wordage because it is a modern name that was given for that continent. It was not around or used in biblical times. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't people in that region, and that doesn't mean that that region wasn't mentioned in the Bible. Specific African regions, nations, and peoples, primarily Egypt, Kush, and Put, are referenced over 1,000 times combined throughout Scripture. So the people that made up Africa, they were mentioned over 1,000 times in the Bible. So Africa was very, very relevant in the Bible. So the people who lived in the region we now call Africa during biblical times, they didn't call it Africa, but they had another name for it. The Egyptians called it Kemet. This was the ancient indigenous name for Egypt, which meant black land. The term came from the rich, dark, and fertile soil left along the Nile River banks by annual floods, which contrasted with deceit, the red land of the surrounding desert. So the Egyptians called this land that is in Africa, the continent of Africa. They called it Kemet. These Egyptians settled all along the Nile River, starting from the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the Nile River goes all the way down into the Congo Basin in Central Africa. And they called the land surrounding the Nile River red. They called it red land. Now, this is interesting because in the Bible, it says that Adam was formed out of the dust of the earth. And the name Adam actually means red. Adama means ground, earth, or soil. Dam means blood. Adam, it means man or mankind, reflecting creation of humanity from the dust of the earth. So it is a strong possibility that Adam and Eve were in Africa. And this aligns with science as well. Science admits that life started out of Africa, that all races of people migrated out of Africa. However, if there was a great flood, which we believe on this channel because we believe the Bible is the truth, this would have created two distinct migration patterns for humans, one before the flood and one after the flood. So I believe the one before the flood started in Africa. But if life got wiped out and Noah and his family only survived, then after the flood, this would have been a new migration pattern than the first. And we know that to be true because Noah and his family landed on Mount Ararat, which is in modern day Turkey. So this is the disconnect when it comes to the evolution of science and the Bible. They completely ignore the flood happening. But biblically, there was a new migration pattern that took place after the flood, and that started in the modern day land of Turkey. And I'll refer to it as its ancient names. It was called Asia Minor. So the populations of the world today all migrated out of Asia Minor after the flood. Nobody was in Africa. After the flood, nobody was in Europe. After the flood, nobody was in Asia. All life was centered right there in Mount Ararat in the land of Asia Minor. So what I'm trying to say is it was after this event that humans began to migrate back into Africa. It was after the flood that humans began to populate Europe and Asia and the rest of the world. So, according to the Bible, the first civilizations were set up in the Mesopotamia region. And the rulers of the very first civilizations were Hamites. Ham had 4 sons mentioned in Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. That is Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. Nimrod, son of Cush, was one of the founders of the earliest imperial cities in the Mesopotamia region in the land of Shinar. The descendants of Mizraim populated Egypt, which scripture frequently refers to as the land of Ham, giving rise to early dynastic pharaohs and a major ancient world power. Canaan became the progenitor of the Canaanite kingdoms later encountered and displaced during the Israelite conquest. So these 4 Hamitic sons of Ham set up kingdoms from the Mesopotamia region all the way down into Africa. Mizraim, aka Egypt, is mentioned over 740 times in the Old Testament alone, serving as a major setting for the Reformed journal narrative, including the early lives of Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, as well as Yeshua's flight from King Herod. Cush was referenced roughly 50 to 60 times, pointing to the ancient kingdom south of Egypt, covering modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia. Put, that is Libya, Cyrene, was North African regions and cities referenced in both Old Testament prophetic texts and New Testament events. The biblical narrative of the Israelites, or the Hebrews, began with Abraham. Ancient Hebrews, such as Abraham, originated in the ancient Near East, specifically the historical region of Canaan, which is now modern-day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. According to biblical tradition, their ancestral patriarch Abraham migrated to Canaan from the Mesopotamia region, which is modern-day Iraq. Then they later became known as Israelites and eventually Jews. Historically and culturally, the ancient Hebrews traced their roots to the southern Levant. The term Hebrew generally translates to the one who crossed over, referring to their nomadic origins and migration across rivers like the Jordan or Euphrates. Biblically, the Israelites descended from Shem through Abraham, and did indeed settle and dwell in lands originally populated or governed by the descendants of Ham, specifically Canaan and Egypt. According to the Torah.com genealogical framework in Genesis 10, Canaan is a son of Ham, and the land of Canaan was promised and eventually inhabited by the Hebrew tribes. Before Abraham and his descendants made their way into the Levant, he grew up in the land of Shinar. He was ruled over by an Hamitic king called Nimrod, who was a tyrant king and attempted to have Abraham killed for refusing to worship idols during those times. This ruler, known as Nimrod in the Bible, was the first prominent post-flood ruler from the lineage of Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons, and a great-grandson of Noah through Cush. According to Genesis chapter 10, verse 8 through 10, Nimrod became a mighty one on the earth and established the first post-flood kingdoms, ruling over Babel, Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. And here is what Easton's Bible Dictionary says about Cush. Cush means black. Cush was a son, probably the eldest of Ham and the father of Nimrod. From Ham, the land of Cush seems to have derived its name. The question of the precise locality of the land of Cush has given rise to not a little controversy. The second river of paradise surrounded the whole land of Cush. Okay, so it says that Cush, the land of Cush, derived from its name. Another name for Cush was also Ethiopia, which means blackface. This is the name that the Greeks and Romans called the land of Cush. These people specifically were known for having a very, very dark complexion. Goes on to say the Cushites appear to have spread along extensive tracts stretching from the upper Nile to the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. At an early period, there was a stream of migration of Cushites from Ethiopia, properly so-called, through Arabia, Babylonia, and Persia to western India. And it goes on to say the Hamite race, soon after their arrival in Africa, began to spread north, east, and west. 3 branches of the Cushite or Ethiopian stock, moving from Western Asia, settled in the regions contiguous to the Persian Gulf. 1 branch called the Kossians settled in the mountainous district on the east of the Tigris River, known afterwards as Susania. Another occupied the lower regions of the Euphrates and the Tigris, while a third colonized the southern shores and islands of the Gulf, whence they afterwards immigrated to the Mediterranean and settled on the coast of Palestine as the Phoenicians. Nimrod was a great Cushite chief. He conquered the Akkadians, a Turanian race, and already settled in Mesopotamia and founded his kingdom. The Cushites mingled with the Akkadians and so forming the Chaldean nation. And it was the Chaldean nation that Abraham came out of. Descendants of Cush were also called Sabians. In the Bible, they are described as tall men or people of stature. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 14, this verse groups them with wealth of Egypt and the merchandise of Cush/Ethiopia, noting their physical height and strength. Isaiah 45:14 speaks of the wealth of nations and people coming over to Yahuwah's side, specifically naming the Sabians, those tall men. Scholars connect the people of Sheba, Sabians, to an ancient trading civilization associated with the region of Cush or South Arabia/East Africa. Ancient historians like Josephus also noted that the region associated with Sheba or Meroe featured people of remarkable height. Typically today, these people dwell in the land of Sudan, and they are still remarkably dark and tall. An example of this is the basketball player known as Bobo. He is one of many tall Sudanese people. As far as the Canaanites, there was various tribes in the land that we call Palestine today. The most notable of these kingdoms of Canaanites were the Phoenicians. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Phoenicians descend from Canaan, the son of Ham and grandson of Noah, making them a branch of the Canaanites. Genesis chapter 10 verse 15 names Canaan as the father of Sidon, an archaic spelling of Sidon, and one of the primary Phoenician city-states, and Heth. The Medic line, even though the Phoenicians spoke a Semitic language similar to Israelites, the biblical genealogy places them under the sons of Ham. The Phoenicians was known to travel around the known world at the time in boats, cruising through the waters of the Mediterranean Sea and settling all along the coast of the Mediterranean. They set up a kingdom or nation called Carthage. They were known as the Carthaginians in North Africa. Carthage and Rome fought a series of three major conflicts known as the Punic Wars between 264 BC and 146 BC. This fighting took place across the Mediterranean region, primarily centered on the strategic island of Sicily in modern-day Italy and the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, mainland Italy, Spain, and North Africa, modern-day Tunisia. So these were Hamites. These were sons of Ham, sons of Canaan, that were fighting Rome. Once again, these were the people that the Israelites lived amongst. And Egypt was mentioned the most out of every nation in the Bible, appearing well over 600 times across both the Old and New Testaments. In the book of Genesis, Egypt served as a refugee during famines for Abraham and later became home to Jacob and his sons, where Joseph rose to power. In the book of Exodus, Egypt acted as the primary oppressive empire from which Moses leads the Israelites out of slavery. The prophets and the Gospels also frequently references Egypt in geopolitical warnings, alliances, and as the place where Mary and Joseph fled to hide the infant Yeshua from Herod. So it was a common thing for Israelites to find refuge in Egypt and also amongst other Hamitic nations. Here's what Nahum chapter 3 verse 8 through 9 says about Israelites seeking refuge or protection from Hamitic people. It says, "Art thou better than populous No, that was situated among the rivers that had the waters round about it, whose rampart was the sea, and her wall was from the sea?" So No, which is also known as Ammon No, was in Egypt. Verse 9, "Ethiopia and Egypt were her strength, and it was infinite. Put and Lubim were thy helpers." So oftentimes in the Old Testament, the Most High compares the Israelite people to these Hamitic peoples, even Cush. And these were the only nations of people that the Israelites were often compared to. So that's how close of a rampart they had with the surrounding Hamitic nations. That's why Hebrew is a part of the Afro-Asiatic language group. Egypt was also where the Israelites had their founder event. According to the biblical narrative, the Hebrews experienced a definitive founder event in Egypt. The book of Genesis described the Israel population transitioning from a single extended family into a vast nation while living in the Nile Delta. So in Africa, this is where they grew into a vast nation, just as the Most High prophesied. Genesis chapter 46 verse 3, and he said, I am Yahuwah, the Elohim of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of you a great nation. The Israelites grew from 70 souls to 2 to 3 million people over the 215-year course in Egypt. Psalm 105 verse 23 through 27 says, Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham. And he increased his people greatly and made them stronger than their enemies. He turned their heart to hate his people, to deal subtly with his servants. He sent Moses his servant and Aaron whom he had chosen, and they showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham. So this is what the region of Africa was being called in those times. It was called the land of Ham. According to Easton's Bible Dictionary, Ham means warm, hot, and hence the south. Also an Egyptian word meaning black. He was the youngest son of Noah, and the curse pronounced by Noah against Ham, properly against Canaan, his fourth son, was accomplished when the Jews subsequently exterminated the Canaanites. So Ham, which is an Egyptian word, meant black. So when it says land of Ham, what is it referring to? This was a land of black people. Hamites were known for being black. And for all the times that these African nations were mentioned in the Bible over thousands of times, the most notable African individuals that often get brought up is only a few. If you ask people about Africans in the Bible, most of them will mention Hagar, which was Abraham's wife or concubine, or they will mention Simon of Cyrene, the man from North Africa who was compelled to carry Yeshua's cross, or the Ethiopian eunuch who was baptized by Philip. Now, does that make sense that African nations are mentioned thousands of times in the Bible? The setting takes place in the African continent. Yet, for all of this, it is hardly represented or shown today that Africans had any role in the makeup of the Bible. They have largely been misrepresented when it comes to the Bible. Why is that? This was done intentionally in the 18th and 19th century. Egypt became associated with whiteness by Europeans and American race scientists, which co-opted and shifted the definition of Hamites. Western intellectuals worked backward from the premise that black Africans were incapable of monumental civilization, reinterpreting Hamites from a biblical group associated with Africa into a supposed branch of the Caucasian race to credit them with Egyptian achievements. In other words, history has been whitewashed. Why did they get away from Africa being the land of Ham, the land of black people? It's important to note that this wasn't always the case. Even during the era of the transatlantic slave trade, European and Islamic traditions often associated Ham and his descendants with dark skin or used the curse of Ham to rationalize African subjugation. Napoleon's 1798 expedition to Egypt revealed grand antiquities that European scholars could not reconcile with their existing narratives of African inferiority. To explain Egyptian brilliance without attributing it to black Africans, 19th century anthropologists like Samuel George Morton redefined Hamites as dark Caucasians, are a separate non-Negro layer of African society, effectively separating ancient Egypt from the rest of the African continent. So this is all new. This barely took place in the 19th century. Before that, it was recognized that Hamites were associated with having dark skin, or they were known to be black Africans, even up until the transatlantic slave trade. And to furthermore distance the biblical narrative from Africa, they even cut through the land of Egypt and built a man-made canal known as the Suez Canal to separate the Levant from Africa.
Pasha. He was a man of immense ambition and tragic flaws. When Ismail came to power, he looked at the dusty streets of Cairo and decided that he would turn them into the Paris of the Nile. He wanted Egypt to be a modern European power. He famously said, "My country is no longer in Africa, we are now part of Europe." And he spent money as if this were true. He built opera houses and palaces. He built thousands of miles of telegraph lines and railways. He hired Italian architects to design new neighborhoods and French chefs to cook his meals. When the Suez Canal opened, he threw the biggest party the world had ever seen. He built a road from the pyramids to the palace, just so his guest, the Empress Eugenie of France, would not get dust on her dress. He commissioned Giuseppe Verdi to write the opera Aida. Champagne flowed like water and diamonds were given away like party favors. But there was a dark side to this glamour. Ismail did not have the money to pay for it. He was borrowing it all from European bankers. In the 1860s, during the American Civil War, the price of Egyptian cotton had skyrocketed, and Ismail thought the good times would last forever. But when the war in America ended, the price of cotton crashed. The income stopped, but the spending did not. Ismail kept borrowing. He borrowed at 10%, then 12%, then 20%. The bankers in London and Paris knew he was doomed, but they kept lending him money because the interest rates were so high they could not resist. By 1875, the interest payments alone were consuming almost the entire revenue of the Egyptian state. The Khedive was robbing his own peasants to pay the bankers in Europe. Now it was November, and a major debt payment was due in a few weeks. The treasury in Cairo was empty. The soldiers were unpaid. The teachers were unpaid. The Khedive was facing humiliation and possibly a coup.
Many of the early archaeologists came to the study of ancient Egypt and ancient Nubia from the perspective of Semitic languages or the study of the Hebrew Bible, and it was very important to them to bring Egypt specifically into the sphere of biblical studies. And so they had to carve Egypt away from Africa to bring it into that sphere. And the way that they did that was they used race. So these early archaeologists effectively made ancient Egypt white in the sense that they made it part of a dominant Western culture, and ancient Nubia was separated from that. It was black.
Genius when it came to the building of the pyramids, do you know what
those are white people, by the way.
Who are white people?
The Egyptians are not African. I'm sorry.
Do you know where Egypt is?
Yes, it's in
Where?
North Africa.
Okay, stop. You stop right there. You just said that you said the Egyptians are not African.
Are white South Africans
African? Wait. Yes, they are African. See, okay, to be African means you come from the continent of Africa. So if you come from the continent of Africa, that's who you are. So that means you're an African. So you do know. Do you also deny science that man originated from Africa, or do you say that's false science?
What are you talking about? I mean, what are you referring to?
I'm talking
Science.
archaeology. I'm talking biology. I'm talking science. In terms of the where did man originate? Where scientists, white scientists.
Egypt was an amazing civilization.
I
it was
say
not created by black Africans. I'm sorry.
It wasn't. Who created it?
People who are white.
How are people?
You can look actually look at art, and they differentiate between races.
I got to ask you a question. How do you
from ancient Egyptian art?
You do know those were black people. You do know.
They weren't.
You do know from science you can't get black from white. You can get white from black. You do know when it comes to evolution.
What?
When it comes.
I see what you're saying.
Dude, you never studied science?
I see what you're. Yes, I have.
No, so but
I mean, I'm not a scientist.
But
are you?
But man originated in Africa. Yes or no?
That is a consensus. Yes.
Okay. So if man originated in Africa, which means that they were Africans, then all of a sudden, when you talk about the amazing works of the Egyptians, they were people of color. I know that's a little rough for you to handle, but I know you want to hold on to that somehow thinking whites built the pyramids, but I'm trying to understand.
Yeah, we did.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Because first of all, they were building things in Egypt while white Europeans were still in caves. That's a fact.
That's a
fact. Okay.
Sure.
Not Benjamin.
No,
His Russian name is Mileiskovsky, not Netanyahu. Why would they change their name though?
to adapt to the Hebrew Jewish narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody posted a video of, I think it was in 17 or 1800s, of an old movie of people that lived in Jerusalem at the time. And most of them were black people.
You can Google again the Egyptian prime minister who says he's not going to accept Jerusalem as it is right now. Because when the blacks left, when the Israelis left here, they were black. Now they came back white. So he's not going to recognize that.
So what do you want me to Google?
You can Google the Egyptian president who refused to accept the white Jews. So they left here as black. Now they're coming back as white. So when did the Jews become white? Because the Fertile Crescent sits on the Platonic stone of Africa, literally. It's impossible that white people can come out of Israel. But
now ask yourself, why did they go out of their way to do such things? Why did they have to lie about the truth? For as much as the Bible has been made Europeanized, the European nations of the known world at that time, such as Rome and Greece, they were mentioned fewer times than any other nations. Rome was mentioned 8 times, all in the New Testament books of Acts and 2 Timothy, while the specific word Greece or its variants like Greeks, Grecians, appears roughly 25 to 30 times across both the Old and New Testaments. So compare that to the amount of times that the nations in Africa was mentioned in the Bible. It changes your entire perception of what you've been made to believe. So when you read the Bible, read it in its proper historical context, because this is what's going to help you understand what you are reading and who you are reading about. Once again, 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 16 says, all scripture is given by inspiration of Yahuwah and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness. And this includes the history in the Bible. It is not irrelevant. It still matters. The truth still matters. So take that into consideration when you're reading. With that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And until next time, thank you for watching, and Yah bless.
then you find these white people, these converted Ashkenazis who converted into Judaism, claiming to be Hebrews and Jews.
Why would they do that though?
It's a religious benefit. It's a religious benefit. Again, it plays into the white supremacy narrative. That they are the chosen people. And because they are chosen people, it resuscitates and sanitizes all white people. It's critical that the Jews must be white, theologically. Because once the Jews are white and they're at the door of the Bible, then anyone who reads this text must read it through the interpretation and the culture of those that are claimed to be Jews. So once the Jews are white, do you have a problem with the word Jesus? Why would you have a problem? It's a rewriting, it's a stealing of black history. Blatant. One of the biggest lies ever told on the face of the earth is that Jews are white. One of the biggest lies ever told historically, academically, ethnographically. Go back and purge through your history books. Find me a white man who was taken as a slave in Israel, from Israel to Egypt, to work to build the pyramids. White people, slaves in Egypt. And Moses came to redeem white people.
What you're seeing right here is Semitic or at least non-Egyptian slaves making straw bricks. It's right there. For centuries, Bible critics would point to the Exodus story. For literally centuries, they would be like, this never happened. It's a national sort of, Semitic myth for national pride. Somebody made this up. And actually kind of the narrative was the Israelites literally were never in Egypt. Bro, this is so fascinating. Okay. So then a few years ago, they dig this up. They find a burial place in Egypt of Egyptian nobles. What you're seeing right here is on the wall of a noble. I'm trying to get this right. The guy's name was Reckmeyer. And this guy, this is on the side of his burial place. He was the second in charge for two pharaohs, a guy named Thutmose III. By dating and just sort of context clues, almost everybody thinks that's the pharaoh who wanted Moses dead. So when there's a whole story about kill all the Egyptian boys and Moses gets thrown in the Nile, he's the dude.
Asiatics who are coming from the east of Egypt. Within the Asiatics, there are Semitic peoples, and within the Semitic peoples, there are the distinctively Hebrew people. And do you have evidence of do you have evidence just of the larger general Asiatic group, or is there actually evidence of the smaller rings within the rings?
Yeah, so we get to the more specific, and that would be people like the Hebrews. So the Semites, the Asiatics, we've got some other inscriptions like Hatshepsut, who was a pharaoh during the 15th century BC, queen. She talks about these Asiatics that lived in the Nile Delta, calls them vagrants. Some people interpret that as sheep herders. They don't worship the sun god Ra. So we're getting some connections to the Israelites and the Hebrews. We've got evidence of Semites being enslaved. Again, wall paintings are very useful because they illustrate these things that would otherwise take a lot of text to write. You see the picture, it's easy, it's visual. But then we get to, are there actually Hebrews or Israelites?
So just to interrupt for clarity, so you've got all Hebrews are Asiatics, all Hebrews are Semites, but not all Semites or Asiatics are Hebrews. But if you've got Semites who are also depicted as slaves, they might well be Hebrew slaves. And we do know that you've got an extensive slave population of people who've come from Canaan in the Nile Delta region, just based on the material culture of these places that have been excavated.